The film Poltergeist marked Hollywood's big-budget engagement with the ghost film in 1982. Produced by Stephen Spielberg and directed by Tobe Hooper, it took the haunted house film and mashed it together with the family adventure film. Throw in some special effects courtesy of Industrial Light and Magic, and you end up with the film that relocated haunted houses to the suburbs. The film does obliquely reference the settlement of land in California and a failure to acknowledge earlier inhabitants of that land, but it also explicitly engages with the growing consumer boom of the 1980s, using technology, here in the form of the TV set, as a means to communicate with the other side. It is a film worthy of study for various reasons. But one of the talking heads in the special feature on the 25th anniversary edition of the film exclaims that everything in the film really happened. Does the depicted activity bear any relation to historically recorded cases of poltergeist activity? And where does the film draw on this record? What are these earlier cases? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are continuing with our unofficial Poltergeist month, which originally was going to just be Ghosts month, but it's turned out to go off on a little bit of a tangent, but that's fine, because this week's episode was actually a request. Because in the first episode of this little mini-series, I did say, if anyone wants me to do anything on Poltergeist, then just let me know, and someone did. So we are going to have a look at how the film does draw on the historical record. Now, I should briefly say, I have no way of knowing if any of the people who actually wrote the film or anything like that actually knew of any of these cases, so we can't necessarily say, oh, this part of the film is drawing on this particular incident or anything like that. But because there are so many accounts, there are quite a lot of examples where some of the things in the film do appear. So even if they didn't directly draw on a particular case, there's a good chance that I've given that as an example, but there's another one that they did draw upon. I did do it in my PhD, but I was actually looking at how the film uses cinematography to actually represent the haunting. So this has got nothing to do with the special effects, which I must admit do look a little bit ropey now. It was actually to do with how it used things like camera angles and colour grading and things like that. So I won't be getting into any of that here. We are going to be having a look at the film in terms of its folklore. I am going to give a brief plot synopsis for anyone who hasn't seen it in a while. This does contain spoilers, but as the film came out 43 years ago, you have kind of had plenty of time to watch it. So if you don't want spoilers, go and watch it first. And please be aware that I'm talking about the 1982 film, I'm not talking about the sequels, and I'm not talking about the 2015 remake. So in the film, the Freeling family live in the new Cuesta Verde housing development in California. The father, Stephen, is a real estate agent and has apparently sold 43% of the houses. His wife, Diane, is a stay-at-home mum, and the couple have 3 children. Dana, 16, Robbie, 8, and Caroline, 5. And they also have a dog who does very little, but does survive. So if that's the thing for you in films, you'll be fine with Poltergeist. After construction work begins on a new pool in their backyard, strange things start happening around the house. Caroline talks to the TV static, claiming she's talking to the TV people, and objects move of their own accord. On one particular night, a pair of spectral hands actually come out of the TV, stretch across the bedroom, and disappear into the bedroom wall. And that's the point where I think a lot of people think that Caroline gets sucked into the TV, but she doesn't. No one goes into the TV, it's the spectral hands that come out of the TV. During a storm, the tree in the backyard tries to eat Robbie, and Caroline is then sucked into another dimension through a portal in the closet. Stephen and Diane turn to the parapsychologist at the local university, who then mount an investigation. More weird stuff happens in the house, and Dr. Lesh, the lead scientist, promises to return with help. And that help takes the form of Tangina, the medium, who proposes a rescue mission. Diane takes her place at the last moment, venturing into the other dimension in search of Caroline. She finds her, and both return safely to this world. But obviously this is a Hollywood film, so that is not where the film ends, and instead the family decide that they are going to move out. I mean, you would. But on the night that they plan to move out, the spirits again attempt to kidnap Caroline, and presumably Robbie, because he's there with Caroline. Diane mounts an incredibly spirited response, And as female characters in horror films go, she's actually quite a good one, and I could riff on that for hours, but she's one of my favourites. But she has to put up with things like skeletons popping out of the mud and water in the barely constructed swimming pool and so on. Eventually Stephen manages to rescue them, and as the family drives away, the house is then sucked into the other dimension, and the film ends with the family staying at a Holiday Inn. And no, I said I wasn't going to mention the sequels, but this is just because I find it quite funny. Poltergeist 2 opens with Stephen on the phone to the insurance company trying to convince them to pay up for the house, but they won't because it hasn't been destroyed. It just simply isn't there anymore. And I just thought that was such a petty moment in a horror film that I thought it was quite funny. But anyway, on with our discussion. So I am going to briefly remind you of the Bolzano, Wallman and Roll poltergeist typology, just because we are going to be revisiting it in this episode, so to save you going back to last week to listen to that if you haven't heard it. This particular typology was originally drawn up by Ernesto Bolzano, Benjamin B. Wallman and William G. Roll in 1982, and it was later revised twice more, and it was based on an analysis of 116 poltergeist cases. So the overall typology suggests that the phenomena focuses on one person, objects move towards specific targets or they follow a strange trajectory. Objects can pass through solid material like walls without damaging said material. Voices, visions, raps or other forms of communication may be present. Exorcisms do nothing. Disturbances often stop if the person of focus leaves the building. Phenomena can happen at any time, day or night. The duration is rarely lengthy and objects involved can sometimes end up hot enough to burn. The other useful collection of poltergeist activity comes from Alan Gold, and he noted the following phenomena attributed to poltergeists. So you have percussive sounds like thuds or raps, the sound of objects being moved, communication by means of a code of knocks, sudden water ingress, outbreaks of fire, interference with electrical equipment, the playing of musical instruments, the cutting, tearing of clothes or soft furnishings, the frightening of animals, the imitation of sounds and voices, the arrangement of objects into patterns, the appearance of lights or figures, so that might be either orbs or phantoms, and the beating, wounding or biting of individuals. So with all of that in mind, let's get into the ways that poltergeist depicts parts of these definitions, because it absolutely does. So the first one we're going to have to look at is the focusing on a single individual, because poltergeist places the focus on Carol Ann, who is depicted as somehow psychic or at least sensitive to the supernatural. There is a suggestion that this is an ability that she inherited from Diane, who is incredibly open-minded about what goes on and really inquisitive about it rather than immediately scared, which is another reason why I really like her. And while the spirits do have some interest in Robbie, they completely ignore 16-year-old Dana, suggesting their interest is in the child's energy and abilities rather than a teenager. Dana is the character in the film that you could completely remove and nobody would notice, like the rest of the film would still happen one way or the other. She contributes very, very little to what's going on. Then we have the short duration of the activity, because Dr. Lesch's assistant Marty describes how poltergeist phenomena rarely lasts long. Now, we did see this with the Bishop Weymouth poltergeist last week, in which the activity only spanned a few months in 1840. Dr. Lesch further adds that hauntings can last for months, if not years, and the sudden onset of activity in this film suggests a poltergeist at work, though the interference of the family in seeking to retrieve Carol Ann means that we can never know if the activity would have likewise ended on its own. Yes, it was of a short duration, but only because Diane rescued Carol Ann. Of course, not all tales of poltergeist are of short duration. For example, the Battersea poltergeist phenomena began in 1956 and continued until 1968. And another case that we're going to keep coming back to is that of the Stans poltergeist in Switzerland. The activity in this particular case actually occurred in two phases. First between August 1860 and October 1861, and then again between August and October in 1862. The whole thing centred around the family home of Melchior Jolla, where he lived with his wife, 7 children and 1 maid. Now, the activity first ended in 1861 when Jolla dismissed their first maid, but then it ended in 1862 because the family abandoned the house, and they actually fled to Zurich in October 1862, having been run out of their home by a combination of sightseers and gossip. The phenomena ceased when they left the house, but his eldest daughter later confirmed that the phenomena did not follow them to Zurich either, which would indicate that it potentially wasn't being caused by a member of the household, or if it was, the move was sufficient to get them to stop. Now, the Bassano typology noted that disturbances often stopped when the targeted individual left the property. In the Stan's case, the Yolla family went to stay elsewhere at one point, and the phenomena did stop during their absence. However, as Gold notes, there wasn't a clear focus for that particular set of activity because of the fact it would even actually go on when there was no one in the house and people were looking in from outside. So it wasn't centering around a specific individual. Everybody was present at something at some point, so it didn't have that individual focus. Now, the next thing we're going to have a look at is voices, because obviously these do appear in some poltergeist cases. Now, the film Poltergeist gives us a twist on this, because when Carol Ann announces they're here, because she's been talking to the TV people through the static, we can hear faint whispers in the TV static. Of course, what marks Poltergeist as being different from actual cases is the identity of the disembodied voice later in the film. Because once she's sucked into the alternate dimension, Carol Ann is the one who provides the disembodied voice, with Channel 12 on the television being the conduit. Now, there is a suggestion that Tangina, the medium, hears other voices, given the amount of information she gleans by walking through the house, but in terms of the activity in the house that we're aware of, the main disembodied voice is that of Carol Ann. Now, other documented cases are far more classic. So in the Stan's case, the first maid heard her name called from the stairs, and she also heard these really uncontrollable sobs in an upstairs room, while deep voices around the house said things like "pity me" and things like that. And then, of course, we've got the voice that spilled the neighbourhood secrets recorded by Giraldus Cambrensis in 1170, not to mention the voice that actually debated scripture in the Bell Witch case. So some poltergeists seem to be rather chatty, which I find quite fascinating. And of course, that's one form of communication. I think the far more classic form of communication is the knocks and raps. And the first time that we hear classic poltergeist sound in the film is once the team assembles in the living room. They've already heard Carol Ann through the TV, and I think by this point they've seen the parade of lights down the stairs. But at this point, loud bangs then come from upstairs, which are loud enough to make the characters jump. They have no obvious origin, since all of the characters that we know to be in the house are in the same room. Obviously, Carol Ann would be the exception to that, but she seems far too small to make noises like that, not to mention she is in another dimension at this point. Now, obviously, noises are one of the things that characterise many poltergeist cases, so I don't need to go through too many of them, because obviously we've looked at some of them before on the podcast. So the banging of a drum gave the Tedworth drummer case its name, although obviously other scratchings and rappings around the house also occurred. And the Stan's case actually began with knocks around the house, footsteps and other noises before it graduated to other phenomena. And during the 1862 manifestation, the noises actually got so loud in the house that passers-by could hear it, which must have been really rather irritating, if nothing else. So we don't really have a huge amount of emphasis on the knocks and raps in Poltergeist, but they are there. That's not the main point of focus. And I think in some ways it's probably just because they're not that cinematic. So that's probably why. But I did mention the parade of lights down the stairs, and that is basically where Poltergeist, I think, puts its emphasis, probably because the effects are being done by industrial light and magic. And overall, the collection of visible spirits in the film seems to be driven more by the production design than any link to specific cases, because we've got the weird floaty lady who appears at the top of the stairs and then comes down the stairs as well. We've got the orbs with the prospector-like figures in them. We've got the ghost dog that guards the door to the children's room, and then the skull with the bulging eyes that comes out of the closet. So as manifestations go, the variety certainly suggests a poltergeist, since various sightings include sightings of a collection of spirits rather than everyone seeing the same thing. But you won't be surprised to learn the Stan's case featured an assortment of phantasms, even if it didn't include moving lights. So the first maid saw a white formless shape in one room, grey shapes in another. One of the children saw the ghost of a small child. And then the second servant saw both a cloud and what looked like a grey shawl drift around inside the house. And even Yolla himself saw shadowy figures that he couldn't explain. So lights and phantasms definitely appear in the historical record. Now, obviously, we do need to bear in mind that some of the things that are included in the film are included for their cinematic value. And the movement of objects is obviously something that works particularly well in cinema. So there's a few instances in the film where this works particularly well. And in one of my favourites, Diane tells Carol Ann and Robbie that she wants the kitchen chairs put back under the table when they're finished with them. And then later she walks into the kitchen to find the chairs all deliberately placed away from the table, like something's defying her. She then puts all the chairs back under the table, and a panning shot follows Diane from the table and then into the kitchen, where she bends down to get something from the cupboard. Obviously the camera follows Diane completely at this point, so we can't see what else is going on in the room. When she then stands up and looks back towards the table, she screams when she sees the chairs have now been stacked on the table. Now clearly Carol Ann isn't responsible for this because she's far too small, but the camera's focus on Diane means that the movement of the chairs is entirely off screen, and it only takes a couple of seconds, so it demonstrates the speed with which the chairs are stacked, not to mention the fact that it's done in total silence. Now the film also includes the seemingly impossible movement of the chairs. So Diane shows Stephen how the spirits will move a kitchen chair across the floor, and the markings on the floor tiles show that she's been extensively testing this throughout the day. They even move Carol Ann across the floor as well, and Diane's description of the sensation tells us that she too has allowed herself to be moved along the floor by unseen hands. But surprisingly, this too has a historical precedent in the Stan's case. Not so much the people being moved around by spirits, but definitely objects being moved around. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there was a point where people could stand outside and look in and see the activity happen. And this was a particular event where the children are terrified and won't go back in the house. So they're standing outside looking back in through the windows, watching the furniture move around inside the house by itself. Later on, the family left the living room in its usual tidy fashion and then went out onto the stairs. They heard a commotion inside the room and rushed back in seconds later to find the table and 2 chairs now upside down. On another occasion, Mrs. Yolla and her eldest daughter watched an invisible force push a chair from its usual spot, flip it upside down and actually smash it to the floor. And while this feels far more destructive than the playful antics of Poltergeist, it is quite interesting to see chairs becoming the plaything of choice across both the film and the real account. And the final category that I wanted to have a look at is actually the apportation of objects. And this is because the Bazzano typology references the movement of objects through solid surfaces and the way in which the objects don't leave a mark on that surface. And Poltergeist then uses that same principle to good effect when the collection of objects apports through the living room ceiling. Now, they're not actually passing through the ceiling itself, but rather a portal in the ceiling. But the appearance of objects from nowhere does appear in recorded poltergeist cases. We also see it in spiritualism as well, where mediums are able to apport items that have apparently appeared from nowhere brought by the spirits. But the collection of objects in Poltergeist is a strange one, because one of the cameo necklaces is at least 100 years old, while the wristwatch only dates back a few years. And it might be tempting to think that the items belong to the dead body still buried beneath the house, but the newness of the wristwatch debunks that theory. Now, more commonly, the object that appears as if from nowhere is the stone, and this throwing of stones is known as lithobolia. There's loads and loads of examples of this, and this dates back centuries. You tend to find the lithobolia accounts are more often church accounts where ecclesiastical descriptions of activity, which obviously they're thinking are demonic, involves this throwing of stones. So it does pop up in accounts. And in the Stan's case, pebbles did appear out of nowhere, both inside and outside of the house. It's quite interesting, so apparently people actually took them away as souvenirs. So there was a physical, tangible piece of evidence that this particular thing had happened. And you could argue that the mugs in the Bishop Weymouth case that disappeared and then later reappeared may have been apported, if not simply misplaced. So is the film Poltergeist actually about a poltergeist? Yes and no. For the bulk of the film's running time, the phenomena actually does fit the criteria for a poltergeist manifestation, and I do think the way that they put these things together does actually work really well on film. And Dr. Lesh raises the possibility of a poltergeist based on that phenomena. But it then gets confused about whether this is a poltergeist or a haunting. So Tangina tells the family that it knows what scares you, and this use of it to denote the spirit again suggests a poltergeist with that malicious, malevolent aspect to it. But then her discussion of stuck souls or crossing into the light and the beast adds religious overtones to the proceedings, and it also takes the events into the realm of a more classic haunting, one in which the house needs to be cleaned before it's safe for human habitation. So obviously if we look at the Bazzano typology, we can see that exercises and rituals do not work for poltergeists, and that did indeed hold true in the Stan's case where a priest's blessings did nothing. And I do think as well, The idea of the house being built on a cemetery is often misunderstood as meaning the house was built on an indigenous burial ground, because even the dialogue of the film reveals that not to be the case, because the headstones in the cemetery at the top of the hill feature burial dates go well into the 1950s. And the clothing of the skeletons that pop through the floor in the film's climax also suggests prospectors or people from that era, which links with the figure seen in the orbs earlier in the film, although obviously some of the caskets that people have been buried in are definitely 20th century, so it does place these burials in a much later time period. And in one of the making of features, one psychic asserts that the objects moving on their own are caused by confused spirits. And obviously there is this idea that poltergeists are just spirits that are kind of acting out for attention. Another says a space may hold a lot of dislocated spirits, which then manifests as a single poltergeist. And the presence of many spirits suggests to me more of a haunting than a poltergeist, particularly because in this film its central thesis is that the houses are haunted because they were built on a cemetery. And there's little to indicate that earlier poltergeist cases had any connection to the land or the property, and instead people assert a connection with individuals, and the history of the house is usually not explored. So when you look at something like the Enfield poltergeist, far more of the attention is paid to which of the girls it's targeting rather than what else happened in that particular house. Or if you have a look at the Bishop Weymouth poltergeist that we looked at last week, or even the Wesley poltergeist, neither of those actually look at the buildings. Now in the Wesley instance, we know that that house was only built about 8 years earlier, so it's not necessarily that it's an old building. Yes, it's on the previous site, but there's no evidence of activity in the house before the original one burns down. So there isn't that link with the house and the land. It's just this link with individuals instead. Alan Gold makes the distinction that, and I quote, poltergeists are outbreaks of spontaneous paranormal physical phenomena centering upon the organism of some particular individual. If apparitions are also seen or voices heard, these are hallucinations consequent upon the upset nerves of uncomprehending persons frightened by the poltergeist phenomena. Hauntings are cases in which visitors to or residents in a particular locality are afflicted with concordant hallucinations, end quote. So that's where he's basically saying that a haunting is a space in which people are sharing hallucinations, whereas in poltergeist cases, you're basically seeing and experiencing stuff that's kind of particular to you as a result of the phenomena, which is why the phenomena, particularly the things people see and hear, can vary so much from individual to individual. And I think ultimately it probably isn't really worth working out if Poltergeist is about a poltergeist or not, because obviously other elements of the film are entirely fictional. To my knowledge, and I could be proven wrong, but no trees have tried to eat children, and as far as I'm aware, no children have been sucked into alternate dimensions through their closet, except perhaps to visit Narnia. So I think that because the ending of the film and some of the set pieces of the film very much take this into the realm of the Hollywood haunted house film, it takes us away from the poltergeist phenomena that was actually there to start with. And I suppose it had to, really, because from a narrative point of view, a poltergeist then just simply stopping of its own accord, as these other ones have in the other cases and so on. It wouldn't really be very cinematic. And I suppose the family abandoning the house takes us at least to the Stans case, where the Stans family do leave and everything ends. Ultimately, I think that the way the poltergeist cases in some of the records do just resolve themselves would really be very cinematic, and that's fair enough. But the film has then gone on to influence how other activity is depicted on film, and therefore what people almost expect from a haunting or poltergeist activity. And this is what I said last week about the fact that we do have to be aware that sometimes media involving hauntings are haunted by the previous things as much as they are anything else. And I know we might talk about that in the sense that things are influenced by what's gone before. Look at the impact that Ghostwatch had. But sometimes it is just literally the fact that people are taking elements from these films that work and then they just keep repeating them, but then they become part of what people are expecting to see. So it's all worth bearing in mind. So I hope that helped you to understand how bits of Poltergeist definitely can be found in the historical record, even though, as I say, we don't know if there's any direct through line between something that might have happened in 1170 Pembrokeshire and then the film. We can't necessarily know that for sure, but it does show that obviously the poltergeist bits are at least based on documented evidence, even if other bits of the film most definitely are not. Next week, we are going to actually have a look at something a little bit different, and this takes us back into the realm of proper folklore, but it does have some dovetail with poltergeist activity, and that is the phenomenon of the screaming skulls, because they can sometimes cause poltergeist-like activity in a home, but there's an actual reasoning behind it, and then you can actually end the activity once you know what it is that the screaming skull actually wants, and so on. So we're going to have a look at those next week. For the final week of August, we are going to be looking at user-generated content, as it were. So I have asked if you have any ghost stories that you'd like to share. And I do want to stress, I'm not looking for personal experiences, and I'm not looking for people to tell me about somebody else's personal experience. So I'm not looking for the kind of thing where it's, this haunting happened to a friend or a neighbour or a relative. These are those things where you're told, avoid that particular place because it's creepy because of this, and cryptids fall into that as well. So it may be that there's a particular area near you where you were told not to go because of a particular thing that lived there, or it may well be that someone told you that your school was haunted, or that the local church was haunted, or whatever. So it's where someone's told you a space near where you are is haunted. They're the kind of things I'm looking to collect, because a lot of them don't get collected. So that's why we're doing this. So it's not about what you've personally experienced or what somebody else's personal experience. It's about those stories that you've been told about the place. And we'll collect some of those together. And I'll see if I can throw some of mine in as well, because I'm sure I can think of some if I put my mind to it. But it'll be really lovely if you can help me out with that. And as I say, it is a good way to actually preserve these stories, because otherwise they can be quite ephemeral and just disappear if people don't actually take the time to write them down, or in this case, record them. So the link for that is in the show notes. But thank you as ever for your attention. Obviously, this whole month is essentially sponsored by Ghost Law, my new book with DK, and by sponsored by, I just mean it came out on August the 7th, so it's kind of the thread that holds this all together. There's no actual sponsorship involved, which is a shame, but it is available now if you would like to order that. But anyway, thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you next week when we'll have a look at Screaming Skulls. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.